From fighting over contracts to not being offered enough fights, here are Dana White's biggest feuds with fighters. Let's get the ball rolling with the most recent one. Yep, I'm talking about Francis Ngannou. Now, Francis has had one of the most legendary rises through the UFC, but unfortunately since then, he's only had issues after issues with the company, and in particular, Dana White. It's no hidden secret that if you want to get under the UFC president's skin, all you have to do is question the money. Well, that's exactly what Francis did, especially after Logan Paul fought Floyd Mayweather. I mean, the fighter isn't wrong about this. Everyone knows that there's a huge unfair gap in the UFC, but still people had no idea how sour things were between the two until UFC 270, until White didn't turn up to put the belt around Francis's waist after he defeated Cyril Gane and defended his UFC heavyweight title. Pretty disrespectful, wasn't it? In January 2023, the Predator announced that negotiations for his new contract with the UFC had failed, and he was being released by the company. And you guys want to know what Dana had to say about it? He tried to suggest that Ngannou was afraid of the competition in the UFC and decided to leave.
I think Francis is in a place right now where he doesn't want to take a lot of risk. Feels like he's in a good position where he could fight lesser opponents and make more money.
Yeah, nobody thinks that's true. Still, no one was really surprised to hear those words come out of Dana's mouth, since belittling fighters has been one of his go-to bullying moves for a long time. It doesn't take a genius to guess that the two might not be on the best of terms. But Francis isn't the only fighter that can't stand Dana. For instance, Mark Hunt's grudge against the UFC president burns quite strongly. This one started all the way back in 2016. Back then, Hunt was selected to fight Brock Lesnar at UFC 200. They typically force a competitor to undergo at least 4 months of drug testing before coming back, but decided to waive that rule when negotiating Lesnar's return. This was pretty unusual at the time. Lesnar then went on to win the fight by unanimous decision. This decision was later overturned. The U.S. Anti-Doping Agency revealed that Brock Lesnar had tested positive for performance-enhancing drugs before the fight. According to Mark, the UFC had intentionally delayed the release of Brock's failed drug test result because of the money they were getting from the fight. Clearly feeling like he'd been wrong, Hunt then went on to file a civil lawsuit against the UFC, Dana, and Brock Lesnar. In a nutshell, he accused the UFC of turning a blind eye towards doping as well as fight fixing to racketeering. Basically, all the things that Dana White doesn't like to be accused of. But if you look at it, the former UFC fighter did have a point. However, much of his lawsuit was dismissed in 2019, and Mark was dealt another blow in 2020 when he was ordered to pay the UFC 6 figures in legal fees. Still, the fighter has vowed to bring the UFC down, but it gets worse. So let's discuss Chris Cyborg and White's strained relationship. Before Ronda Rousey became the face of women MMA fighters, it was Chris Cyborg who was on the rise. But unlike Ronda, Chris has always been at odds with the UFC president, especially when it came to the negotiation of her fights and not being given the amount of promotion she deserved. It became such a big problem that Cyborg decided to leave the UFC because of it. Over the years, Chris has accused Dana of not treating her with respect, especially after he made some sexist comments about her. And back in 2017, the two ended up calling each other liars over a potential fight with former champion Ronda Rousey. Dana claimed that he'd offered the fight to Chris, but she turned it down due to concerns about the weight cut. Cyborg, on the other hand, said that she received no formal offer for the fight. Just pure drama with these two. In 2019, Chris was released from her UFC contract. After that, she pretty much took every opportunity to bash the UFC president and even called him a bully. Cyborg has since signed with a rival organization, Bellator MMA, and likes to take digs at White occasionally as a side hobby. The UFC president also didn't hold back and has called Chris a nightmare to work with after she left.
Dealing with her has been a nightmare the entire time she's been here.
Yeah, I don't think I would want to have White as my enemy anytime soon. But some fighters don't mind bringing out the worst in Dana, like BJ Penn. Now, BJ Penn's place in the UFC folklore is confirmed. And even though the UFC president and the UFC Hall of Famer might be on good terms now, this wasn't the case back in 2004. Penn had just ended Matt Hughes' reign as the champion and had won the title. Now, there were a lot of options on the table for him, since the title bout had been the final one in his contract. But rather than re-signing with White, the Prodigy decided to explore free agency. He was quickly offered a huge deal by Japanese promotion K1, and Penn decided to go with it, forcing White and the UFC to strip him of his title, something that didn't sit too well with the UFC president. Now, White did say he was excited to move on and crown a new champion, but everyone else knew that that wasn't the case. The Prodigy later on said that Dana had called him up and given him an earful. According to Penn, he was told by Dana that he'd never fight in the UFC ever again. Yikes! That obviously didn't turn out to be true. Moving on, this video wouldn't be complete if I didn't mention the beef between Tito Ortiz and the UFC president. The beef between the Huntington Beach bad boy and the UFC president is perhaps the greatest one of them all. The two of them were once close friends, but soon the relationship between them turned sour over money. Ortiz wanted more money to fight his former friend Chuck Liddell than the UFC was willing to pay. Tito claimed he was being underpaid, so he opted to test the free market. After that, both of them took every opportunity to badmouth each other. The UFC president has called Ortiz one of the most dishonest human beings he's ever met. And Tito famously wore a shirt reading, "Dana is my bitch," at the weigh-in for UFC 84. Incredibly, the fighter found his way back into Dana's good books. And then a move to rival promotion Bellator turned things sour between them once again. The word is that the two have made up again, but who knows how long that'll last. Now, this next fighter is someone that angered Dana so much that he's been nearly erased from UFC history. It's Frank Shamrock and his long-standing grudge for the UFC Supremo. The majority of fighters who fall out with the UFC president tend to kiss and make up eventually, but that hasn't been the case with Frank. He was a champion way before White and the Zuffa brothers took over the UFC, but the fighter never hit it off with them. Since then, he's literally done everything within his power to badmouth Dana in every interview he does. His relationship with the UFC is so bad that even though Frank is one of the most decorated champions, he's been largely erased from UFC history. And we all know who's behind that. Even Ortiz and Randy Couture haven't been treated this badly. The UFC president even labeled Shamrock as mentally unstable. Safe to say, Frank is definitely one man White ought to avoid if he's out and about. Well, there you have it. These were Dana White's biggest feuds with fighters.
But here's the thing. Once you have people that have done the experience, you don't really have to go on the journey. You can find somebody who went on the journey and be like, "Hey, buddy."
What's funny is that you're like this bookish, nerdy kid who's like academically inclined and is reading all these books. Like, you could have learned these lessons.